Buck's hands trembled as he clicked replay for the 7th time in the past hour. The blue glow of the laptop screen carved harsh shadows across his weathered face in the pre-dawn darkness of his kitchen. Coffee had gone cold beside him hours ago, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the timestamp, 2:47:23 a.m. Movement in the bottom right corner of the frame. The infrared camera captured it clearly, something tall, impossibly tall, moving between his Angus with fluid grace, not the awkward shamble of a bear on its hind legs, not the darting panic of a wolf caught in the open. This thing moved with purpose, with intelligence that made Buck's stomach clench. He paused the footage and leaned closer. The creature's head turned directly toward the camera, as if it knew exactly where the device was mounted. Yellow eyes reflected the infrared like twin stars, and Buck could make out the elongated snout, the pointed ears set high on a skull that was wrong, all wrong. Too big for a wolf, too canine for a man. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, the words echoing in the empty farmhouse. The kitchen felt different now, smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves were pressing inward. Every creak of the old timber frame, every sigh of wind through the eaves, carried new menace. Buck had lived in this house his entire life. Born in the back bedroom, raised at this very kitchen table, married Sarah in the front parlor 32 years ago. But tonight, it felt like a stranger's home. He forced himself to continue the footage. The creature moved methodically through the herd, and Buck noticed something that made his blood run cold. The cattle weren't panicking. If anything, they seemed docile, compliant, as if they were under some kind of influence. At 2:51:14, the screen went black. Buck jabbed the spacebar, but the recording had simply ended. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. That's all the evidence he had of the impossible. Rising from the table, his joints protesting after hours in the same position, Buck shuffled to the kitchen window. Dawn was still hours away, but he could make out the fence line of the north pasture where it happened, where his cattle, his livelihood, his inheritance, his pride, had vanished without explanation. He'd discovered the disappearance at first light during his regular morning rounds. The gate had been closed and latched, exactly as he'd left it. The fence showed no signs of damage, but where 43 head of Angus should have been grazing, only 31 remained. The missing 12 included Brunhilde, his prize-breeding cow, worth more than his truck. What bothered him most wasn't the financial loss, though God knew he couldn't afford it. What kept him awake, replaying that footage until his eyes burned, was the complete absence of evidence. No blood, no tracks beyond the fence line, no broken posts or cut wire. It was as if the cattle had simply evaporated. The border collie, Rex, had been with him during that morning discovery. The dog had approached the pasture eagerly, as always, then stopped dead at the gate. His hackles rose, a low whine escaping his throat. Rex had backed away, ears flat, and nothing Buck could do would convince the dog to enter that field. Even now, Rex lay in his bed by the kitchen door, awake and alert, occasionally lifting his head to stare at windows that showed only darkness. Buck pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled through the contacts until he found Sheriff Kowalski's number. His thumb hovered over the call button. What would he say? That something out of a horror movie had stolen his cattle? That he had footage of a creature that couldn't exist? He'd already called once, yesterday morning, reporting the missing livestock. Kowalski had been sympathetic but practical. Wolves were getting bolder, and cattle rustling was on the rise. The sheriff promised to send Deputy Martinez out to take a look, though they both knew the chances of recovery were slim. But that was before Buck had thought to check the trail camera. The device had been Sarah's idea, installed 3 years ago after they'd lost a calf to what the vet assumed was a wolf attack. "Knowledge is power, Buck," she'd said, adjusting the camera strap around the oak tree. "Can't fight what you can't see." Sarah had been gone for 11 months now. 11 months of empty beds and silent dinners and conversations with a dog that couldn't answer back. Some nights Buck almost convinced himself he could still smell her lavender soap on the pillow beside him. He closed the laptop with a soft snap that seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot. Outside, the October wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending something skittering across the porch, probably leaves, though Buck's imagination supplied other possibilities. Tomorrow, he'd have to make a decision. Call the sheriff and risk sounding like a man who'd finally cracked under the weight of isolation and grief, or keep the secret and hope whatever had taken his cattle was satisfied with what it had claimed. But as Buck climbed the stairs to his empty bedroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 4:30 a.m., same as it had every morning for the past 40 years. Buck's hand shot out automatically, silencing the bell before his mind fully registered consciousness. His body moved through the motions, feet hitting the cold hardwood, joints creaking like the old house settling around him. But his thoughts remained tangled in the previous night's discovery. In the bathroom mirror, his reflection looked older than his 58 years. Grey stubble covered hollow cheeks, and his blue eyes, once sharp as winter sky, appeared dulled by exhaustion and something else. Fear, maybe, or the peculiar weight that comes from seeing the impossible. The coffee maker gurgled to life as Buck pulled on his work clothes, the same Carhartt jacket Sarah had given him for Christmas 5 years ago, still carrying the faintest ghost of her perfume in its collar. His hands paused on the zipper. Every morning, he faced this moment, the choice between remembering and forgetting, between holding on to Sarah's presence and letting the day's necessities wash her away. Rex appeared at the kitchen door, tail wagging with diminished enthusiasm. Even the dog seemed subdued, as if last night's revelation had settled over the entire ranch like fog. Buck filled the coffee thermos and grabbed his work gloves, but his eyes kept drifting to the closed laptop on the table. "Come on, boy," he said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "Cattle won't feed themselves." The October air bit through his jacket as they stepped outside. Frost glazed the truck's windshield, and his breath formed silver clouds that dissipated quickly in the mountain wind. This was the hour Buck had always loved most, when the world belonged to him and the livestock, when the silence held promise instead of loneliness. But this morning, the darkness seemed deeper, more watchful. He drove the familiar route across his land, checking the remaining cattle in the south pasture first. The Angus lifted their heads at his approach, calm and predictable, nothing like the eerie docility he'd witnessed in the footage. His grandfather had started this herd in 1952 with 6 head and a prayer. His father had expanded it to over 100 during the good years. Now Buck struggled to maintain 50, fighting against market prices, drought, and the simple fact that ranching was a young man's game. The work was routine. Check water troughs, inspect fence lines, distribute hay, but Buck's attention kept wandering to the tree line. Every shadow might conceal something impossible. Every movement in his peripheral vision made him start. When a magpie burst from the brush, he actually reached for the rifle mounted in his truck cab. At Thompson's feed store, his weekly stop for supplies, the normalcy felt almost surreal. Ed Thompson greeted him with the same gruff nod they'd exchanged for 20 years, and they discussed the weather, the coming winter, the likelihood of early snow. Buck found himself studying Ed's face, wondering if he'd heard about the missing cattle, if word was already spreading through Granite County's tight-knit ranching community. "Heard you had some trouble with wolves," Ed said, hefting a bag of grain into Buck's truck bed. "Sheriff Martinez was asking questions yesterday." "Might be wolves," Buck replied, the lie sitting heavy in his mouth. In this world of men who earned their living from the land, reputation mattered. A rancher who couldn't protect his herd was a rancher headed for bankruptcy. Buck had seen it happen before, the gradual erosion of respect, the whispered conversations, the slow transformation from peer to object of pity. At the Grange Hall, where he stopped to pick up mail, Martha Williams offered her usual condolences about Sarah, the same stilted words she'd repeated for 11 months. Buck nodded politely, but inside, her sympathy felt like salt on an open wound. Everyone in town knew his story, the devoted couple who'd never had children, who'd poured their parental love into the land and each other. Sarah's sudden heart attack had left him more than widowed. It had made him incomplete. The afternoon brought fence repairs on the eastern boundary, work that required focus and physical exertion. Buck welcomed the distraction, the familiar rhythm of post-hole digging and wire stringing. But even here, in bright daylight, he found himself glancing over his shoulder. The forest pressed close to this section of his property, dense pine and fir that could hide anything. As evening approached, Buck faced the dreaded return to the empty house. He delayed with unnecessary chores, cleaning tools that were already clean, reorganizing the barn, checking locks twice. Rex watched patiently, understanding his master's reluctance to enter the space where silence lived. Finally, with darkness falling and the laptop waiting on the kitchen table, Buck could postpone no longer. He had a decision to make, one that would either restore his world to its previous predictable boundaries or thrust him into territory where the rules no longer applied. The house felt different as he climbed the porch steps, not threatening exactly, but expectant, as if something important was about to begin. Buck's hand hesitated on the kitchen door handle. Through the window he could see the laptop exactly where he'd left it, closed but somehow ominous in the gathering darkness. Rex pressed against his leg, a warm reminder that he wasn't completely alone in this. Inside, the familiar sounds of the old house settling seemed amplified. The tick of the mantel clock Sarah had loved, the whisper of wind through gaps in the window frames, the soft groan of floorboards that had supported 3 generations of Henley boots. Buck moved through his evening routine mechanically, hanging his jacket on the peg by the door, washing his hands at the kitchen sink, heating leftover stew that tasted like cardboard, but his eyes kept returning to the laptop. He'd managed to convince himself, during the daylight hours of honest work, that maybe he'd been mistaken. Maybe the creature in the footage was just a bear, distorted by the infrared camera's strange perspective. Maybe grief and isolation were finally taking their toll on his sanity, making him see monsters where none existed. Rex suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked toward the front of the house. The dog's low whine made Buck's stomach clench. He set down his spoon and listened, but heard nothing beyond the usual night sounds. Still, Rex remained alert, focused on something Buck couldn't perceive. "What is it, boy?" Buck whispered, but the dog just whined again and padded toward the living room window. Buck followed, his sock feet silent on the hardwood. He peered through the curtains into the yard, illuminated only by the weak glow from the porch light. Nothing moved among the familiar shapes of his truck, the water pump, the old oak where Sarah used to hang laundry. But Rex's hackles were rising, the way they had yesterday morning at the pasture gate. The sound, when it came, was barely audible, a soft thump from the direction of the mailbox at the end of his long gravel drive. Buck squinted into the darkness, but the mailbox lay beyond the reach of his porch light. Probably just the wind knocking something around, or a raccoon investigating garbage. Rex growled, a sound Buck had rarely heard from the gentle border collie. "Stay here," Buck commanded, though his voice came out shakier than intended. He grabbed the heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped onto the porch, leaving the dog inside. The October night was crystal clear, stars brilliant in the thin mountain air. His breath formed clouds as he played the flashlight beam across the yard, then along the gravel drive toward the road. Everything appeared normal until the light reached the mailbox. The metal flag was up. Buck's pulse quickened. The mail had already come that morning. He'd collected it himself on his way back from town. And postal delivery didn't run this late. Someone had been here. Someone had put something in his mailbox after dark. He should go back inside, lock the doors, call Sheriff Kowalski. But his feet carried him forward, drawn by a curiosity stronger than caution. The gravel crunched under his boots, each step echoing off the surrounding forest. The flashlight beam wavered slightly as his hand trembled. Inside the mailbox lay a manila envelope, unmarked except for his name written in block letters across the front, Thomas Henley. No postmark, no return address. Buck's name wasn't even Thomas anymore. Everyone had called him Buck since childhood. Only official documents, and Sarah, when she was particularly exasperated with him, used his given name. The envelope felt substantial, as if it contained photographs. Back in the kitchen, with the doors locked and Rex pressed against his leg, Buck stared at the envelope. 2 impossible things in 2 days. The logical part of his mind insisted they had to be connected, but connecting them meant accepting that his orderly world had fundamentally changed. With fingers that felt clumsy and cold, he opened the envelope. Photographs spilled onto the kitchen table. 8 by 10 color prints, crisp and clear. Buck's breath caught in his throat. The images showed his missing cattle, alive, standing in what appeared to be a natural enclosure of rock walls and pine trees he didn't recognize. Brunhilde was clearly visible in the center of the group, her distinctive white marking on her forehead unmistakable. The other 11 were there too, looking healthy, unharmed, but somehow different. Their eyes held that same strange docility he'd witnessed in the trail camera footage. Buck flipped through the photos with growing disbelief. Someone had taken his cattle. Someone had them confined somewhere. Someone wanted him to know they were alive. The last photograph was different. Instead of cattle, it showed a piece of paper with a message written in the same block letters: "They are safe. For now. Stop looking." Buck's hands shook as he set the photo down. The kitchen felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing inward. Outside, Rex began barking frantically at something in the darkness. He faced a choice that would define everything that came after. He could burn the photographs, delete the trail camera footage, and try to return to his previous life. Or he could open the laptop, study the creature again, and step into a reality where the impossible was not only real, but had taken a direct interest in him. The barking stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Buck reached for the laptop and opened it. The laptop's screen flickered to life, casting blue light across the scattered photographs. Buck's finger hovered over the trackpad, but he couldn't bring himself to click on the video file. The message echoed in his mind: "Stop looking." It wasn't a request, it was a warning. He pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping against linoleum that Sarah had picked out when they'd remodeled the kitchen 15 years ago. Everything in this house carried her memory, and now something alien was intruding on that sacred space. The photographs felt contaminated somehow, as if touching them might spread whatever madness had infected his orderly world. Rex hadn't returned to the kitchen. Buck could hear the dog pacing in the living room, nails clicking against hardwood, occasionally pausing at windows to whine softly. Even his most loyal companion sensed that the rules had changed. Buck stood and walked to the kitchen sink, gripping its porcelain edge until his knuckles went white. Through the window, his land stretched into darkness, 160 acres that his grandfather had carved from wilderness with sweat and determination. 4 generations of Henleys had worked this soil, fought drought and debt and wolves, built something lasting. Now that legacy felt as fragile as morning frost. What if he called Sheriff Kowalski right now? Spread the photographs across the desk at the courthouse, played the trail camera footage on the sheriff's computer. Buck could already picture Kowalski's expression, the careful neutrality that meant he was humoring a man who'd finally cracked under pressure. Buck had seen that look before, directed at other ranchers who'd lost too much, whose grief or desperation had led them to make wild claims. The whispers would start within days. Poor Buck Henley, never been the same since Sarah passed. Living out there all alone, talking to that dog like it's people, seeing things that ain't there. His credibility, built over decades of honest dealing, would evaporate. Banks didn't extend loans to crazy men. Buyers didn't purchase cattle from unreliable sources. He'd lose everything his family had built, become another cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and grief. But the alternative terrified him even more. Buck returned to the table and picked up one of the photographs, studying Brunhilde's placid expression. His prize breeding cow looked healthy, well-fed, but something in her eyes disturbed him. The intelligence was still there, but muted somehow, as if she was seeing the world through thick glass. He'd raised that cow from a calf, knew her temperament better than most people knew their dogs. Brunhilde had always been alert, aggressive, protective of her offspring. The docile creature in the photograph was a stranger wearing his cow's face. They are safe. For now. The message implied negotiation, as if his cattle were hostages in some incomprehensible transaction. But what did the thing in the footage want from him? What did a creature that shouldn't exist need from a struggling rancher whose best days were behind him? Buck's coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he drank it anyway, needing something to do with his hands. The bitter liquid reminded him of all the dawn mornings he'd shared with Sarah at this same table, planning their days, discussing the herd, arguing gently about whether to plant winter wheat in the south field. She'd always been the practical one, quick to dismiss his occasional flights of fancy with affectionate exasperation. "What would you do?" he whispered to the empty air, half hoping for an answer that wouldn't come. Sarah would have wanted proof, evidence. She'd taught high school biology for 30 years before retiring, had spent her life distinguishing between fact and superstition. But she'd also been fearless in pursuit of truth, willing to follow evidence wherever it led. If Sarah were here, she'd already have the laptop open, studying the footage frame by frame, looking for details he'd missed. But Sarah wasn't here, and Buck was tired of being brave. He gathered the photographs into a neat stack, his movements deliberate and slow. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to burn them, feed them to the wood stove along with any memory of bipedal creatures and impossible disappearances, report the missing cattle as wolf predation, collect what insurance he could, and try to rebuild his herd with the breeding stock that remained. He could do it. He could choose ignorance, choose the comfortable lie over the terrifying truth. Thousands of people lived their entire lives without confronting the impossible. He could be one of them. But as Buck reached for the matches in the drawer beside the sink, Rex began barking again, sharp, urgent barks that raised the hair on Buck's arms. Through the kitchen window, he glimpsed movement at the edge of the yard, a shadow that separated itself from the darkness near the barn. Something was watching the house. Buck's hand froze on the matchbox. Outside, the shadow shifted, and for just an instant, he caught the silhouette of something too tall to be a bear, too wrong to be human. The choice was no longer his to make. The matchbox fell from Buck's nerveless fingers, scattering wooden sticks across the linoleum. Outside, Rex's barking reached a frenzied pitch, each sharp bark punctuated by growls that seemed to tear from the dog's throat. Buck stood frozen at the kitchen sink, his eyes locked on the shadow near the barn. It moved with deliberate slowness, shifting its weight from one leg to another in a motion that was unmistakably bipedal. Even in the darkness, Buck could see it was massive, broader through the shoulders than any man, tall enough that its head would clear the barn's 8-foot doorframe. The creature seemed to be studying the house, its posture patient and calculating. Buck's rational mind screamed at him to duck below the window, to grab his rifle, to call for help. Instead, he found himself leaning closer to the glass, drawn by a horrible fascination. This was the thing from his trail camera footage. This was what had taken his cattle. The creature turned its head toward the kitchen window, and even across the 40 yards of darkness, Buck felt the weight of its attention settle on him like a physical presence. 2 points of reflected light gleamed where its eyes should be, catching the weak glow from the porch lamp. They regarded each other across the space, predator and prey, hunter and quarry, though Buck wasn't certain which role belonged to whom. Then the creature stepped backward into deeper shadow and vanished, as if the darkness had simply swallowed it whole. Rex's barking cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so complete that Buck could hear his own pulse hammering in his ears. The dog whined once, a sound full of confusion and fear, then padded back toward the kitchen on unsteady legs. Buck remained at the window, searching the darkness for any sign of movement, but the yard appeared empty. Had he imagined the whole encounter? Was his grief-addled mind finally manufacturing the monsters his logic had been denying? But Rex's behavior proved otherwise. The border collie slunk into the kitchen with his tail between his legs, seeking comfort against Buck's leg with an urgency that spoke of genuine terror. Dogs didn't react that way to figments of imagination. Buck looked down at the photographs scattered across his table, then at the closed laptop that contained footage of the impossible. The creature had shown itself to him deliberately, he realized. It could have remained hidden, could have watched him from the forest where he'd never spotted among the trees. Instead, it had positioned itself in his yard, under his porch light, making sure he saw it clearly. The message was unmistakable. I know where you live. I know you've seen me. I know you have the photographs. His hands shaking, Buck gathered the photos and stacked them neatly beside the laptop. The smart choice, the safe choice, had been taken from him the moment that Shadow moved in his yard. Whatever was happening here was bigger than his comfort, bigger than his fear of ridicule or financial ruin. His cattle were alive somewhere, held by something that defied every natural law he'd ever accepted, and it wanted him to know. Buck opened the laptop and clicked on the video file. The infrared footage began playing, showing his peaceful herd in the moments before their disappearance. He watched the familiar scene unfold, but this time he studied every detail with the intensity Sarah would have brought to her microscope slides. Frame by frame, he analyzed the creature's movements, its posture, the way it seemed to catalogue each cow before making its selections. There, a detail he'd missed before. As the creature approached Brunhilde, it paused and tilted its head in a gesture that seemed almost conversational. Not the behavior of a mindless predator, but something far more disturbing. Intelligence, purpose, perhaps even communication with the docile cattle. Buck replayed the sequence 3 times before moving to the photographs. Under the kitchen's bright fluorescent lights, he could make out more details in the images of his captive herd. The rocky enclosure appeared natural but carefully chosen, high walls that would prevent escape, but with grass and water visible in the background. Wherever his cattle were being held, they were being cared for. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't random predation or simple theft. Someone, something, had specifically targeted his herd, studied his routines, planned the timing of the theft. The creature in the footage hadn't been hunting. It had been executing a carefully orchestrated plan. But why? What did it want from him? Buck closed the laptop and stared at his reflection in the dark kitchen window. Somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness of the Bitterroot Mountains, his life's work was being held hostage by something that shouldn't exist. He could retreat into denial, could burn the evidence and pretend none of this had happened. Or he could step across the threshold into a world where the impossible was not only real, but had taken a personal interest in destroying everything he'd built. Buck reached for his truck keys, his decision made. There would be no going back. The truck's engine turned over reluctantly in the cold, coughing to life like an old man waking from uneasy sleep. Buck sat behind the wheel for a long moment, his breath fogging the windshield as he stared into the darkness beyond his headlights. Rex whined from the passenger seat, sensing his master's tension but unwilling to be left alone in the house. Where exactly did a man go to find answers about creatures that shouldn't exist? Buck pulled onto the county road, his headlights carving a tunnel through the October night. The logical first stop would be Sheriff Kowalski's office, but Buck knew how that conversation would end. Even with photographs and video footage, he'd sound like every other rancher who'd lost too much and couldn't accept simple explanations. Kowalski was a good man, but he dealt in facts that could be documented and filed in triplicate. Instead, Buck found himself driving toward the Whispering Pine Tavern, the only establishment in Granite County that stayed open past 9 o'clock. If anyone had encountered something unusual in these mountains, if anyone had seen things that didn't fit into neat categories, they'd eventually find their way to Walt Kerner's bar. The tavern's neon sign buzzed and flickered as Buck pulled into the gravel parking lot. 3 other vehicles sat outside, more company than he'd expected for a Tuesday night. Through the frost-covered windows, he could see warm yellow light and the silhouettes of men hunched over drinks. The door chime announced Buck's arrival, drawing glances from the handful of patrons scattered throughout the dim interior. Walt Kerner looked up from wiping down glasses behind the bar, his weathered face creasing into a smile of genuine welcome. "Buck Henley. Haven't seen you in here since Sarah's funeral." Walt's voice carried the careful tone of a man who understood grief. "What can I get you?" "Coffee, if you've got it fresh, and maybe some conversation." Walt poured steaming coffee into a heavy ceramic mug, studying Buck's expression with the practiced eye of a barkeeper who'd learned to read trouble before it announced itself. "You look like a man carrying heavy thoughts." Buck wrapped his hands around the mug, grateful for the warmth. "Walt, In all your years in these mountains, you ever hear stories about unusual wildlife? Things that didn't quite fit the normal categories? The question hung in the air like smoke from the tavern's ancient wood stove. Buck felt the attention of the other patrons shift toward their conversation, though none of them turned around directly. Depends on what you mean by unusual. Walt's voice dropped to a conversational murmur. These mountains are old, Buck. Older than any of us can properly understand. Sometimes old places hold on to things that maybe should have moved on. From a corner booth, a gravelly voice spoke up. You losing cattle, Henley? Buck turned to see Clayton Mesa, a leathery man in his 70s who ran a small operation up near the Canadian border. Clayton had a reputation for straight talk and little patience for bullshit, but his eyes held something Buck hadn't expected. Recognition. Yeah. 12 head, night before last. No tracks, no blood, no sign of struggle. Clayton nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. Same as happened to me 3 years back. Lost 8 prime breeding cows. Sheriff figured it for rustlers, but rustlers don't work that clean. Rustlers leave sign. Another voice joined from the bar, Pete Carrera, whose ranch bordered the national forest. I found tracks once, October, 4 years ago, after I lost some stock. Prints like nothing I'd ever seen. Too big for a wolf, wrong shape for a bear. Bipedal. Buck's pulse quickened. You report them? Pete snorted. Reported them to Fish and Wildlife, to the sheriff, to anyone who'd listen. You know what they told me? Hoax tracks. Kids playing pranks. Case closed. He turned on his bar stool to face Buck directly. But I made plaster casts before they could dismiss them. Still got them at home if you want to see something that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about these mountains. Walt set down his towel and leaned against the bar. There's been stories for generations. My grandfather used to tell about shepherds who'd lose whole flocks, but only during certain times of year. Always October. Always near the anniversary of some local tragedy. The old-timers called it the mourning season. Mourning season. Buck's coffee had gone cold in his hands. Theory was that grief draws them. Strong emotion, loss, isolation. It's like a beacon to whatever walks these high places. They don't just take randomly. They take from people who've already lost something important. Buck's chest tightened. Sarah's death anniversary was next week. The same timing as every cattle disappearance he'd experienced. The same timing that connected Clayton's loss, Pete's missing stock, the pattern he'd been too blind to see. There's someone else you should talk to, Clayton said quietly. Emma Hartwell, over in Missoula. Wildlife biologist, but she's been documenting unexplained predation events across the northern Rockies. Academic types usually don't listen to ranchers, but she's different. She's looking for patterns nobody else wants to admit exist. Buck pulled out his phone and typed the name into his notes. For the first time in days, he felt something other than helpless confusion. He wasn't alone. Others had faced this impossible reality and survived to compare notes. The rules were becoming clearer, even if they defied everything he'd believed about the natural world. Buck stared at the name glowing on his phone screen. Emma Hartwell. The letters seemed to pulse with possibility in the tavern's dim light. A wildlife biologist who documented unexplained predation events, someone with the credentials to be taken seriously but the open mind to acknowledge what others dismissed. You got contact information for her? Buck asked Clayton. The older rancher pulled a worn business card from his wallet. Met her at a cattlemen's association meeting last spring. She was asking questions about livestock losses that didn't fit standard predation patterns. Most folks thought she was wasting her time, but I kept her card. Buck studied the card. Dr. Emma Hartwell, Wildlife Biology Department, University of Montana. A Missoula phone number and email address. Real credentials from a real institution, not some conspiracy theorist with a blog. She helped you with your missing cattle. Helped me understand I wasn't crazy, Clayton said. That's worth something when the whole world's telling you to accept simple explanations for impossible events. Walt refilled Buck's coffee without being asked. Emma's good people. Lost her own family to something unexplained about 5 years back. Hiking accident up in Glacier that never made sense to anyone who knew the country. Since then, she's been dedicated to finding answers nobody else wants to look for. The weight of shared loss settled over the conversation like evening fog. Buck understood the drive to make sense of senseless tragedy, the need to find patterns in chaos. If Emma Hartwell had channeled her grief into scientific investigation, she might be the only person who could help him navigate this impossible situation. "I should call her," Buck said, though even as he spoke, doubt crept into his voice. "How did you explain to a university professor that something from folklore had stolen your cattle? How did you describe infrared footage of a bipedal creature without sounding like every other rancher who'd snapped under pressure?" Pete Carrera finished his beer and stood to leave. "Don't overthink it, Henley. Show her the evidence and let her draw her own conclusions. Scientists like evidence, even when it doesn't fit their textbooks." After Pete left, the tavern fell into comfortable quiet. Buck found himself studying Clayton and Walt, these men who'd accepted impossible realities without losing their sanity. They carried the knowledge like a burden, but not one that had broken them. "How do you live with it?" Buck asked. "Knowing something like this exists, but not being able to prove it to anyone who matters?" Clayton's weathered hands wrapped around his glass. "You learn to pick your battles. Some truths are too big for most people to handle. But that doesn't make them less true. The thing is," Walt added, "once you've seen behind the curtain, you can't unsee it. World's bigger and stranger than most folks are comfortable admitting. Question becomes whether you let that knowledge destroy you or whether you find a way to use it." Buck thought about the photographs waiting on his kitchen table, about the shadowy figure that had watched him from his own yard. The creature knew he'd seen it, knew he had evidence of its existence. This wasn't just about understanding what had taken his cattle. This was about surviving whatever came next. "I need to prepare," Buck said, the realization hitting him with sudden clarity. "Whatever this thing wants, whatever it's planning, I need to be ready." "Preparation's smart," Clayton agreed. "But first you need information. Call Emma Hartwell. Find out what she knows about the patterns, the timing, the behavior. Knowledge is the only weapon we've got against something like this." Buck pocketed the business card and stood to leave. Rex lifted his head from where he'd been sleeping by the door, immediately alert to his master's movement. "Buck," Walt called as he reached for the door handle. "Whatever you decide to do, don't do it alone. These mountains have swallowed up plenty of men who thought they could handle the impossible by themselves." The cold air hit Buck like a slap as he stepped outside, but it felt clean after the tavern's smoky interior. He helped Rex into the truck and sat for a moment, engine running, staring at Emma Hartwell's business card in the dashboard light. Tomorrow he would call her. Tonight, he needed to go home and prepare for whatever was coming. The creature had shown itself deliberately, had made sure he knew it was watching. That wasn't the behavior of something that planned to disappear back into the wilderness. It wanted something from him, and Buck had the sinking feeling he was about to find out what. As he pulled onto the county road, Buck caught movement in his rearview mirror, a tall shadow detaching itself from the tree line behind the tavern. It stood motionless in the middle of the road, watching his taillights disappear into the darkness. The approach had begun, and Buck was no longer just an observer of impossible events. He was a participant, whether he wanted to be or not. The ordeal begins. Buck's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. The shadow in his rearview mirror seared into his memory like a brand. The creature wasn't hiding anymore. It was announcing its presence, marking its territory, claiming ownership of this twisted game they'd somehow begun playing. The ranch appeared in his headlights, like a sanctuary that might not offer sanctuary much longer. Buck parked close to the house, scanning the tree line for movement before helping Rex down from the cab. The border collie pressed against his legs, whimpering softly. Even the dog understood that something fundamental had shifted in their familiar world. Inside, Buck's hands shook as he tried to dial Emma Hartwell's number. 3 times he misdialed, his fingers refusing to cooperate. When he finally connected, the phone rang once before going to voicemail. "Dr. Hartwell, this is Thomas Henley, rancher in Granite County. Clayton Mesa gave me your card. I have evidence of something you need to see. Something that took my cattle. I know how this sounds, but I have footage, photographs. Please call me back." He left his number and hung up, immediately regretting how desperate he'd sounded. But desperation was honest, and honesty might be the only currency that mattered now. Buck spread the photographs across his kitchen table again, this time arranging them chronologically. The progression was unmistakable, his cattle alive and apparently unharmed, but clearly captive. Someone had taken these pictures after the disappearance, which meant someone wanted him to know his herd survived. The question that gnawed at him was simple and terrifying. What did they want in return? The answer arrived at 11:47 p.m. Rex erupted into frantic barking, but this time the sound carried a note Buck had never heard before. Not warning or protection, but pure animal panic. The dog scrambled toward the back of the house, away from whatever approached from the front yard. Buck grabbed his rifle and moved to the living room window. His porch light illuminated a scene that violated every natural law he'd ever believed in. The creature stood in his driveway, no longer hiding in shadows or existing at the edge of vision. 7 feet of impossible anatomy, covered in coarse dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its head was distinctly canine but wrong, too large, too intelligent, too knowing. Yellow eyes fixed on the house with unmistakable intent. In its oversized hands it held something white. Buck's breath caught. An envelope, identical to the ones that had contained the photographs of his missing cattle. The creature took 3 deliberate steps forward and placed the envelope on his porch steps. Then it straightened and looked directly at the window where Buck stood frozen, rifle suddenly feeling inadequate in his hands. For a moment that stretched into eternity, predator and prey acknowledged each other across the species barrier that should have been absolute. The creature's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth designed for tearing flesh. Then it turned and walked, not ran, walked, into the darkness between the barn and the equipment shed, disappearing as if the night had swallowed it whole. Buck stood paralyzed for 10 minutes before forcing himself to move. Rex refused to accompany him to the door, instead cowering under the kitchen table with his tail wrapped around his body like a shield. The envelope lay precisely centered on the top step, as if placed by a delivery service rather than something that shouldn't exist. Buck's name was written across the front in the same block letters he'd seen before, but this time the handwriting seemed more deliberate, more practiced. Inside was a single photograph and a folded piece of paper. The photograph showed Buck himself, taken through his kitchen window earlier that evening. He could see himself sitting at the table, studying the pictures of his missing cattle, his face clearly illuminated by the overhead lights. The angle suggested the camera had been positioned exactly where the creature had been standing when it watched him from the yard. The paper contained a simple message: tomorrow. Sunset. North pasture gate. Come alone. Bring nothing. You have questions. I have answers. Your cattle have 3 days. Buck read the note 4 times, each reading making the situation more real and more impossible. The creature could write. It could plan. It could make threats and set deadlines. This wasn't some mindless beast driven by predatory instinct. This was intelligent, purposeful, and terrifyingly organized. 3 days. The deadline landed on October 15th, the exact anniversary of Sarah's death. The connection crystallized with sickening clarity. This thing hadn't chosen him randomly. It had studied him, learned his patterns, identified his vulnerabilities, his grief, his isolation, his dedication to the cattle that represented everything he and Sarah had built together. All of it had been catalogued and weaponized. Buck sank into his kitchen chair, the weight of impossible reality crushing down on him like a landslide. Tomorrow at sunset, he would face whatever walked upright in the Bitterroot Mountains. He would meet something that defied nature itself and somehow find the courage to demand answers. The ordeal had begun, and Buck Henley was no longer a rancher who'd lost some cattle. He was prey. Buck stared at the note until the words blurred together, his exhausted mind struggling to process the impossible ultimatum. Sleep was out of the question, but sitting in his kitchen under the harsh fluorescent lights felt like volunteering to be a target. He killed the lights and moved to his bedroom, where he could watch the yard from behind curtains while maintaining the illusion of normal nighttime routine. Rex refused to leave the kitchen, remaining huddled under the table as if the wooden surface could protect him from something that defied the natural order. Buck didn't blame him. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that facing the creature was suicide disguised as negotiation. But his cattle were alive somewhere, and in 3 days they would be dead. Dawn arrived grey and merciless, bringing no relief from the previous night's revelations. Buck made coffee with shaking hands and tried Emma Hartwell's number again. Still voicemail. He left a second message, this one shorter and more urgent. Dr. Hartwell. Thomas Henley again. The situation has escalated. I'm meeting with the entity tonight at sunset. If you don't hear from me by tomorrow morning, contact Sheriff Martinez in Granite County. The evidence is on my kitchen table. The words sounded like a man recording his own death warrant. Buck spent the morning checking his property boundaries, ostensibly looking for signs of the creature's presence but really trying to convince himself he still had some measure of control. He found tracks near the equipment shed, the same impossible prints he'd seen weeks ago but fresh enough that moisture still beaded in the deepest impressions. The creature hadn't left after delivering its message. It was still here, somewhere in the maze of gullies and timber that surrounded his ranch, watching, waiting. By afternoon, Buck's phone had become an object of desperate hope. Every few minutes he checked for missed calls from Emma Hartwell, from Sheriff Martinez, from anyone who might offer an alternative to walking into the darkness to meet something that should not exist. The silence stretched like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. At 4 o'clock, his resolve cracked. Buck loaded his rifle, filled his pockets with extra ammunition, and climbed into his truck. If he was going to die tonight, he wouldn't die wondering what might have happened if he'd tried to fight back. The creature had said to bring nothing, but the creature also had 40 pounds and 6 inches on him, plus claws designed by evolution to tear flesh from bone. The north pasture gate sat at the end of a rutted dirt road that wound through a stand of lodgepole pines before opening into grazing land that stretched to the base of the Bitterroot Mountains. Buck had installed the gate himself 15 years ago, back when the future seemed predictable and monsters existed only in campfire stories. He parked 50 yards from the gate and waited, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the tree line for movement. Sunset painted the mountains in shades of amber and rust, the kind of beauty that had convinced him and Sarah to build their life in this remote valley. Now that same isolation felt like a trap closing around him. The creature emerged from the trees at exactly sunset, moving with the fluid confidence of an apex predator in its own territory. Buck's hands tightened on his rifle, but something in the creature's posture made him hesitate. It wasn't stalking or threatening. It was approaching for conversation, as impossible as that seemed. 20 feet from the truck, the creature stopped and spoke in a voice like gravel grinding against granite. "You brought a weapon." Buck's world tilted. The creature could speak, not just write, not just plan, but communicate in fluent English with an accent he couldn't place. "You didn't say anything about weapons." "I said, bring nothing. A weapon is something. So is the intelligence to use it," Buck replied, surprised by his own steadiness. "You want to talk, we talk, but I'm not getting out of this truck unarmed." The creature's massive head tilted in what might have been amusement. "Your rifle fires. 206 Springfield cartridges. Effective range approximately 800 meters against targets with standard bone density and muscle mass. Against my physiology, you would need to achieve precise placement in one of 3 locations to ensure immediate incapacitation. Your hands are trembling. Your accuracy at this distance under stress conditions is significantly compromised." Buck's blood turned to ice water. The creature hadn't just studied his patterns, it had studied his equipment, his capabilities, his weaknesses. This wasn't a negotiation between equals. This was a predator explaining to its prey exactly how futile resistance would be. "What do you want?" Buck asked. Though he already suspected the answer would destroy whatever hope he'd carried into this impossible conversation. The creature's yellow eyes reflected the truck's headlights like twin spotlights. What I've always wanted, Thomas Henley. What your grief has been calling to me for 7 years. Every October, every anniversary of loss. Buck's finger moved to his rifle's trigger, but the creature continued speaking, and its words hit harder than any physical blow. I want you. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, but Buck found himself laughing, a harsh, bitter sound that surprised them both. That's it? 7 years of watching, planning, taking my cattle, and you want me? His grip tightened on the rifle. Well, here I am. What's stopping you? The creature's yellow eyes never wavered. You misunderstand. I don't want to kill you, Thomas Henley. I want you to choose. Choose what? To join her. The words hit Buck like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making the rifle feel impossibly heavy in his hands. Sarah's name hung unspoken between them, but her presence filled the space like smoke from a funeral pyre. You're lying. But even as Buck spoke, memories began crystallizing with horrible clarity. Sarah's final weeks, the way she'd spoken about seeing things in the woods during her evening walks, the strange peace that had settled over her in those last days, as if she'd found answers to questions she'd never asked aloud. The morning he'd found her in the north pasture, curled beneath the cottonwood where they'd been married, with no signs of struggle, and that same inexplicable peace on her face. Sarah came to me, the creature continued, its voice carrying an almost gentle quality that made Buck's skin crawl. 7 Octobers ago. She was dying, yes, but slowly, painfully. The cancer eating through her bones like acid. She walked to the boundary between your world and mine, and she chose no. Buck's voice cracked. The doctors said her heart stopped. Natural causes. Her heart stopped because she willed it to stop, because I showed her another way. A place where pain doesn't exist, where the boundaries between life and death become negotiable. Buck's mind reeled, trying to process impossible implications. The cattle. They're with her. She tends them, yes. In a place between spaces, where what you call death is merely a different form of existence. She's been waiting for you, Thomas. Every October, when your grief peaks, when you stand in that same pasture and beg the universe to take you too, she's been calling to you through me. The revelation hit Buck like a landslide, burying everything he thought he understood about Sarah's death, about his own survival, about the 7 years of hollow existence that had followed. Show me, he whispered. The creature stepped closer to the truck, and Buck could see intelligence burning in those yellow eyes, not animal cunning, but something approaching wisdom. I cannot take you to her against your will. The boundary can only be crossed by choice, and choice requires understanding of what you're choosing between. Then help me understand. Your world operates on linear time. Birth to death, beginning to end. But consciousness, what you call the soul, exists beyond those constraints. Sarah discovered this truth in her final weeks, when the pain became so overwhelming that her awareness began separating from her dying body. She saw through the veil between worlds and found me waiting. Buck's rational mind screamed that this was madness, hallucination brought on by grief and isolation. But the creature's words explained too many inconsistencies, answered too many questions he'd been afraid to ask. The photographs he managed. Evidence, proof that death is not ending, merely transformation. Your cattle chose to follow Sarah when I offered them the chance. In her world, they feel no cold, no hunger, no fear. They exist in eternal contentment, waiting for their shepherd to join them. And if I refuse, then you continue as you have, alone, growing older and more isolated with each passing year, until your body fails and deposits you in whatever afterlife your beliefs have constructed. Sarah will wait, but not forever. Even love has limits in a universe of infinite possibilities. Buck stared at the creature, this impossible being that claimed to be a bridge between worlds, a ferryman offering passage to something beyond death. Part of him wanted to pull the trigger, to end this madness with violence and return to the simple grief he understood. But a larger part, the part that had been dying slowly for 7 years, whispered that this moment had been inevitable since the morning he'd found Sarah beneath the cottonwood. Why October? Why the anniversary? Because that's when the boundary weakens. When your grief reaches its peak intensity, it creates resonance, a frequency that allows communication between worlds. Sarah has been calling to you every October, but only now is your despair deep enough for you to hear her voice through mine. Buck lowered his rifle, the weight of impossible truth settling into his bones like winter cold. Everything shifted. His understanding of Sarah's death, his own purposeless survival, the meaning behind 7 years of escalating isolation. The creature hadn't been stalking him, it had been waiting for him to become desperate enough to listen. She's really there, alive. Death and life are inadequate terms for what she has become. But yes, Thomas Henley, Sarah waits for you in a place where suffering ends and love transcends the limitations of flesh. The choice crystallized before him with terrifying clarity. Everything he'd believed about reality was wrong, and everything he'd lost might still be recoverable. The revelation was complete, and Buck Henley stood at the threshold of an impossible decision. The silence stretched between them like a bridge Buck wasn't sure he had the courage to cross. The creature stood motionless in the dying light, waiting with the infinite patience of something that existed beyond the constraints of linear time. Buck's hands trembled on the rifle he'd lowered, the weight of impossible truth heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. "I need proof," Buck said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "If Sarah's really there, if this isn't some elaborate delusion brought on by 7 years of grief, I need to see her." The creature's massive head tilted slightly. "Proof requires risk. To show you her world, you must step partially into it. There are no guarantees you'll be able to return unchanged." Buck laughed, the sound hollow in the mountain air. "Unchanged? Look at me. I've been dead for 7 years, just too stubborn to lie down. What's left to change?" "More than you realize," the creature replied. "But very well. Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark and the boundary thins further, I will open a window between worlds. You will see Sarah, speak with her, understand what she has become. Then you must choose. Follow her into eternity or return to your dying world with knowledge that will either save you or destroy you." Buck nodded, though his throat felt lined with sand. "Where?" "The cottonwood where you found her, where she made her own choice 7 years ago. The tree has become significant, an anchor point between what was and what could be." The creature began to turn away, then paused. "Thomas Henley, prepare yourself. The woman you will see tomorrow night is Sarah, but she is also more than Sarah. 7 years of existence beyond death changes consciousness in ways your language cannot adequately describe. Do not expect the wife you lost. Expect the soul she became." With that warning, the creature melted back into the darkness between the trees, leaving Buck alone with his truck's headlights and a decision that would determine not just his future, but his understanding of what future even meant. Buck drove home in a daze, his mind churning through the implications of what he'd learned. The ranch felt different as he pulled into his driveway, not abandoned or isolated, but transitional, like a way station between destinations. Even Rex seemed to sense the change, emerging from under the kitchen table to greet him with cautious optimism, rather than the terror that had dominated his behavior since the creature's first appearance. Inside, Buck found himself moving with purpose for the first time in years. He pulled out photo albums he hadn't opened since Sarah's funeral, studying her face in their wedding pictures, their early years building the ranch together, the gradual changes that had marked her illness. In the final photographs, taken just weeks before her death, he could see something in her eyes he'd missed at the time. Not resignation or fear, but anticipation, as if she was looking towards something just beyond the camera's frame. The phone rang at midnight, jolting Buck from his memories. Emma Hartwell's voice was tight with professional concern and personal exhaustion. "Mr. Henley, I got your messages. I'm sorry I haven't called back sooner. I've been driving from Missoula. I'll be at your ranch by morning." Buck felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. "Dr. Hartwell, thank God. I need to tell you what's happened." "Not over the phone," she interrupted. "What you're describing sounds like acute psychological stress, possibly complicated by isolation-induced hallucinations. I'm bringing equipment to document whatever we're dealing with, but I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Don't do anything alone until I arrive. Don't go into the woods. Don't follow tracks. Don't respond to any contact from whatever you think you've seen. Can you promise me that?" Buck stared at the cottonwood visible through his kitchen window, its bare branches stark against the star-filled sky. Tomorrow night he would stand beneath those same branches and see Sarah again, or discover that 7 years of grief had finally driven him completely insane. "I promise," he lied. After hanging up, Buck spent the remaining hours until dawn writing. Not a suicide note or confession, but a detailed account of everything that had happened since the first trail camera footage. If he didn't survive tomorrow night's encounter, if the boundary between worlds claimed him as it had claimed Sarah, someone needed to understand what had really happened in the remote valleys of Granite County. As sunrise painted the mountains in shades of hope he'd forgotten existed, Buck sealed the account in an envelope and placed it on his kitchen table where Emma would find it. Then he walked outside to check on the animals that remained, the horses, the surviving cattle, Rex padding at his heels like a faithful guardian. For the first time in 7 years, Buck Henley had a plan that extended beyond mere survival. Tonight, he would discover whether love truly transcended death, or whether grief had finally completed its long work of destroying him. Either way, the waiting would finally end. The morning air carried the bite of approaching winter as Buck moved through his remaining cattle with mechanical precision. Each animal he checked felt like a goodbye to responsibilities that had defined him, to a life that had become mere habit, to the illusion that he could continue existing in this hollow space between Sarah's death and his own inevitable end. Emma Hartwell arrived at 9:30, her University of Montana research vehicle kicking up dust clouds as it navigated the rutted driveway. Buck watched from his kitchen window as she unloaded equipment cases and surveying instruments, her movements efficient and purposeful. She represented everything he was about to abandon: rational inquiry, scientific method, the comfortable assumption that reality operated according to predictable laws. "Mr. Henley," she called as she approached the house, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone trained to deal with unstable individuals. "I'm Dr. Hartwell. We spoke last night." Buck emerged from the kitchen, struck by how young she seemed despite her obvious competence. Mid-30s maybe, with intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing and the weathered hands of someone who spent more time in the field than behind a desk. Under different circumstances, he might have appreciated having such an ally. "Appreciate you coming all this way, Doc," he said, extending his hand. "Though I suspect you'll think the trip was wasted once you understand what we're dealing with." Emma's handshake was firm, her gaze direct. "Why don't you walk me through everything from the beginning? I've brought trail cameras with infrared capability, audio recording equipment, and plaster for making casts of any tracks we find. Whatever's happening here, we'll document it properly." Buck almost smiled at her confidence. Documentation seemed quaint when faced with something that existed between worlds, but he led her to his kitchen table where the manila folders and printed photographs lay spread like evidence in a crime scene. As Emma examined the trail camera footage and missing cattle reports, Buck found himself studying her face for the moment when professional skepticism would give way to the same terrible certainty that had consumed him. "The image quality is poor, but this definitely shows a large bipedal figure," Emma said after several minutes. "Could be someone in a costume, though the proportions are unusual. The timing correlation with your cattle disappearances is interesting, but not necessarily causal. Have you considered that someone might be using the creature sightings as cover for rustling operations?" "Look at this one," Buck said, sliding another photograph across the table. "From 3 nights ago. Tell me that's a man in a costume." Emma studied the image, the creature's yellow eyes reflecting the camera flash, its impossible musculature, the intelligence visible in its predatory stance. Buck watched her expression shift from analytical detachment to confused concern. The morphology doesn't match any known North American wildlife, she admitted. But photographic evidence can be manipulated, especially with current digital technology. We need to establish a baseline of physical evidence before drawing conclusions. Buck understood her position, but watching Emma apply scientific rigor to something that transcended science felt like watching someone try to measure eternity with a ruler. Tonight would render all her careful methodology irrelevant. They spent the afternoon investigating the property boundaries, Emma cataloguing prints and taking measurements while Buck provided context he couldn't fully explain. Near the equipment shed, they found the creature's fresh tracks, deeper and more detailed than any Buck had seen before, as if it was no longer concerned with concealing its presence. "These prints are remarkable," Emma said, kneeling beside the clearest impression. "The size suggests an animal weighing at least 400 pounds, but the gait pattern indicates bipedal locomotion. I need to compare these with known primate tracks, but honestly, I've never seen anything like them." As afternoon faded toward evening, Buck felt the approaching confrontation like pressure in his bones. Emma had documented everything with professional thoroughness, but documentation couldn't prepare her for what was coming. He'd promised to wait for her arrival before doing anything dangerous, and technically he'd kept that promise. But tonight's encounter with Sarah wasn't something he could share or postpone. "Dr. Hartwell," Buck said as they returned to the house, "I need you to understand something. Whatever's happening here, it's not finished. Tonight there's going to be another contact, and it's not something I can avoid or delay." Emma stopped walking, her expression shifting to sharp concern. "Mr. Henley, if you believe this creature is going to approach you again, we need to contact local law enforcement immediately. Sheriff Martinez should—" "No." Buck's voice carried a finality that made Emma step backward. "This isn't a matter for sheriffs or scientists. This is something I have to face alone." The truth was simpler and more terrible than Emma could understand. Tonight, Buck would discover whether love could survive death itself, or whether 7 years of grief had finally prepared him to join Sarah in whatever lay beyond the boundary between worlds. The choice was his to make, but it was also inevitable, the culmination of everything that had brought him to this moment. As darkness gathered around the ranch, Buck Henley prepared to finish what had begun 7 years ago beneath a cottonwood tree. Emma refused to leave, despite Buck's increasingly insistent arguments that she should return to Missoula before full darkness settled over the valley. She'd set up her equipment in the kitchen, transforming his table into a makeshift command center with thermal imaging displays and audio monitors that crackled with static from the wind moving through bare branches. "I'm not abandoning a research subject who's clearly experiencing psychological distress," she said, adjusting the sensitivity on her recording equipment. "Whatever you think is going to happen tonight, having a witness present is the safest option for everyone involved." Buck knew there was no safe option for what lay ahead, but arguing with Emma would waste precious time. The creature had specified midnight at the cottonwood, and Buck could feel the approaching hour like gravity pulling him toward an inevitable collision. He'd spent 7 years preparing for this moment without knowing it. Every sleepless night, every morning he'd forced himself to continue breathing, every October anniversary that had carved away another piece of his will to live in this world. At 11:30, Buck retrieved his rifle from the gun cabinet and checked the chamber. Not because he intended to use it, but because facing the impossible required the comfort of familiar rituals. Emma watched him with growing alarm. "Mr. Henley, if you're planning to confront this creature armed, I absolutely cannot allow—" "You can't allow." Buck's laugh held no humor. "Doc, I appreciate your professional concern, but what's about to happen is beyond your training or mine. The best thing you can do is stay in this house and document whatever you can from a distance." He opened the kitchen door, feeling October's bite cut through his jacket. The night was perfectly clear, stars brilliant in the thin mountain air, with no moon to soften the absolute darkness between the trees. Rex whined from his position under the table, every instinct warning him against venturing into such darkness. "At least take a radio," Emma insisted, pressing a handheld transceiver into Buck's palm. "Maintain contact, so I know you're alive." Buck pocketed the device without argument, though he doubted radio waves would penetrate the boundary between worlds. As he walked across the frozen pasture toward the cottonwood, Emma's voice crackled through the speaker. "Buck, I'm reading thermal signatures near your position. 2 large forms approximately 50 yards from the tree." Buck clicked the radio twice in acknowledgement, but didn't respond verbally. Speaking would break the growing sense of ritual, the feeling that he was participating in something that had been choreographed long before his birth. Each step toward the cottonwood felt like approaching the edge of existence itself. The creature emerged from the shadows when Buck was 20 feet from Sarah's tree, its massive form somehow more solid and real than it had appeared in previous encounters. Tonight it moved with ceremonial dignity, like a priest approaching an altar. "You came," it said, and Buck heard genuine respect in that inhuman voice. Many lack the courage to face truth when it threatens everything they believe about reality. "Where is she?" Buck's voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "Close. The boundary thins at the moment of greatest significance, the anniversary hour when Sarah made her choice. But first, you must understand what you're asking to see. The woman who waits beyond death is not diminished by dying, Thomas Henley. She has become more than human consciousness can typically contain." The air around the cottonwood began to shimmer, as if heat waves were rising from the frozen ground. Buck felt pressure in his ears like rapid altitude changes, and the familiar landscape started to blur at the edges. Through the radio static, he could hear Emma's voice growing distant and distorted. "Buck, the thermal readings are going crazy. Temperature dropping rapidly around your position." "What's happening?" "The window opens," the creature said. "Look carefully. She has waited 7 years for you to see what she became." The shimmer intensified, and through it Buck glimpsed something impossible. A landscape that occupied the same space as his pasture, but existed under different rules. The grass was green despite the season, and cattle grazed in eternal contentment, not just his missing animals, but generations of livestock that had died on this land over the decades, and walking among them, tending them with gentle authority, was Sarah. But Sarah transformed, luminous, existing in a state that transcended the limitations of flesh while remaining recognizably herself. When she looked up and saw Buck watching through the dimensional window, her smile held all the love they'd shared and more, a joy multiplied by freedom from pain, from fear, from the constraints of linear time. "Thomas," her voice reached him across impossible distance, "I've been waiting for you to see. Death isn't ending, beloved. It's graduation." The final test had begun, and Buck Henley stood at the threshold of a choice that would determine not just his fate, but his understanding of what fate itself meant. The dimensional window pulsed wider, and Buck felt himself pulled forward, not by physical force, but by 7 years of accumulated longing suddenly given direction. Sarah stepped closer to the boundary between worlds, her transformed presence radiating warmth that cut through October's bitter cold. The creature's massive hand fell on Buck's shoulder, claws pricking through his jacket. "Not yet. You must choose with full understanding." "Understanding?" Buck's voice cracked with desperate fury. "I understand I've been dying by inches for 7 years while my wife existed just beyond reach. I understand you've been stealing my cattle to show me glimpses of paradise. What more is there to understand?" "The price," the creature said, "and the permanence." Through the shimmering portal, Sarah moved with fluid grace that belonged to no earthly physics. The cattle around her, Buck recognized animals that had died decades ago, alongside the recently vanished Angus, grazed in impossible contentment, their eyes holding awareness no living beast possessed. She chose transformation over healing, the creature continued, its yellow eyes reflecting depths Buck couldn't fathom. When cancer claimed her body, Sarah refused the final sleep. She accepted elevation to something beyond human death, beyond human limitation. But such existence requires sustenance. Buck's blood turned to ice water. Sustenance, life force. The boundary between worlds demands payment for passage. Your missing cattle feed the portal, their essence converted to energy that maintains this realm. Sarah tends them in their transformed state, but their sacrifice powers her existence. Through the radio's static, Emma's voice carried increasing panic. "Buck, you need to get away from there. I'm reading massive electromagnetic disturbances, temperature fluctuations impossible for natural phenomena. Whatever's happening, it's dangerous." Buck ignored the warning, his attention locked on Sarah's luminous form. She was speaking now, her words carrying across dimensional barriers with heartbreaking clarity. "Thomas, I've been so alone. I chose this existence because I couldn't bear leaving you, but the separation has been agony. Join me, beloved. Let go of that dying world and embrace eternity." "The choice is permanent," the creature emphasized, its grip tightening on Buck's shoulder. "Cross the boundary and you cannot return. You will exist as Sarah exists, transformed, sustained by the life force of others, bound to this realm until the stars burn cold. Your human life, your human death, your human soul, all forfeit. And if I refuse?" Sarah continues alone. The portal closes. You return to your empty house and eventual natural death, never knowing whether love truly transcends mortality. Buck stared at his wife's transformed face, memorizing details that belonged to dreams and nightmares. She was beautiful beyond human comprehension, but her beauty carried wrongness, too much awareness, too much intelligence, like staring into the eyes of something wearing Sarah's face, but containing infinities she'd never possessed in life. "The cattle," Buck said suddenly, terrible understanding crashing over him. "You didn't just take them for food, you took them to test me, to see if I'd follow." The creature's laugh rumbled like distant thunder, partially correct. Each missing animal was an invitation, a demonstration of the portal's reality, but also a warning. See how easily life crosses from your world to ours? See how transformation changes even simple beasts into something more? Through the window, Buck watched a familiar bull, his prize Angus that had vanished 2 months ago, approach Sarah with movements that suggested worship rather than animal instinct. The bull's eyes held human-like intelligence, and when it looked toward Buck, he saw recognition that chilled him deeper than October wind. "My God," Buck whispered. "They're still aware, still themselves, but—" "Changed," the creature confirmed, "as Sarah is changed, as you would be changed. Consciousness expanded beyond flesh, beyond linear time, beyond the comfortable limitations of mortality. Some call it damnation, others call it apotheosis." The radio crackled with Emma's increasingly frantic voice. "Buck, I'm calling for emergency backup. Sheriff Martinez is en route with search and rescue. Get back to the house immediately." But Buck felt time slowing, moments stretching like taffy as the choice crystallized before him. Step forward into Sarah's waiting arms and abandon everything he'd ever been. Stay rooted in frozen earth and live the remainder of his natural life knowing she existed just beyond reach, sustained by stolen life force, waiting in transformed loneliness. Sarah pressed against the dimensional barrier, her luminous hand reaching toward him across impossible distance. "Choose quickly, Thomas. The window won't remain open much longer. Choose love over fear. Choose eternity over emptiness." Behind Buck, truck headlights swept across the pasture as Sheriff Martinez arrived at the house. Emma's thermal equipment would show him the truth. 2 figures standing near the cottonwood, air shimmering with energy that defied natural law, a woman's form visible through a crack in reality itself. The creature released Buck's shoulder, stepping backward into shadow. "Decide, Thomas Henley. Some choices echo through eternity. Others end it." Buck raised his foot, poised between worlds. Buck's foot hovered above the threshold, the dimensional boundary pulling at him like gravity. Sarah's luminous face filled his vision, her transformed beauty promising an end to 7 years of suffocating grief. Behind him, truck doors slammed and Emma's voice grew frantic over the radio, but those sounds belonged to a world that suddenly felt distant and insubstantial. "Thomas, Sarah whispered, her voice carrying impossible harmonics. "Come to me." Buck stepped forward and stopped. Through the portal's shimmer, he saw movement beyond Sarah's transformed figure. The missing cattle grazed in eternal twilight, but their eyes held trapped awareness, consciousness expanded beyond their ability to process. They'd been changed, elevated, made more than they ever could have chosen to become. His prize bull approached Sarah with worship-like devotion, but Buck recognized the creature's expression, not contentment, but resignation. "They didn't choose this," Buck said, his voice cutting through the dimensional static. "The cattle. They were taken, transformed without consent." The creature's yellow eyes narrowed. "Choice is a luxury of higher consciousness. They serve a greater purpose, like Sarah served your purpose." The portal flickered, Sarah's image wavering as Buck's words struck something fundamental. For 7 years he'd grieved her death as random cruelty, cancer claiming another victim despite medical intervention. But what if Sarah's refusal to accept healing hadn't been her choice alone? "You were there," Buck realized, stepping back from the threshold. During her final weeks, when the pain medication stopped working, when she started seeing things in the hospital room corners, the creature's massive form seemed to solidify, becoming more present and menacing. Sarah was dying regardless. "I offered transformation instead of oblivion. You offered a dying woman false hope. You fed on her desperation." Through the portal, Sarah's luminous face twisted with confusion. "Thomas, what are you saying? I chose this existence to wait for you. I chose love over death." "No," Buck said, grief and rage crystallizing into terrible clarity. "You chose fear over acceptance. You couldn't let go, so you accepted imprisonment disguised as immortality." The radio crackled with Emma's voice. "Buck, Sheriff Martinez is mobilizing search and rescue. Whatever's happening, help is coming. Help." Buck almost laughed at the concept. No human authority could address what stood before him, a creature that fed on love twisted into obsession, that offered eternity to those too desperate to recognize eternal servitude. But perhaps help came in different forms. Buck pulled the radio to his lips. "Emma, are you monitoring thermal signatures around the property?" "Yes. Why?" "Can you track the energy source maintaining this portal?" "Static, then. There's a massive heat signature beneath the cottonwood. Something generating incredible energy about 6 feet underground." The creature snarled, recognizing Buck's shift in tactics. "You cannot destroy what you don't understand." "I understand enough." Buck unslung his rifle, not aiming at the creature but at the ground beneath the cottonwood's gnarled roots. "You need an anchor point. Something to tether this dimensional window to our reality." "Thomas, no." Sarah's voice carried desperate panic now. "If you sever the connection, I'll be trapped alone forever." Buck's hands trembled as he raised the rifle. 7 years of love, loss, and longing warred with the growing certainty that Sarah's continued existence was an abomination fed by innocent sacrifice. The cattle, his neighbor's missing livestock, countless animals transformed into unwilling servants, all to maintain a portal that trapped his wife in a state between life and death. "I love you, Sarah," Buck said, tears freezing on his cheeks. "I've loved you since the day we met. But love means letting go when holding on causes suffering. You don't understand." The creature lunged forward. Buck fired. The rifle's crack echoed across the frozen pasture, the bullet striking the earth beneath the cottonwood with supernatural precision. Immediately, the portal convulsed like a wounded animal. Sarah's image flickered, her transformed beauty wavering as the dimensional anchor point destabilized. "Thomas," her voice stretched across impossible distance. "I forgive you." The window collapsed with a sound like breaking glass multiplied by thunderclaps. The creature roared in fury and pain before dissolving into shadow that scattered on October wind. The cottonwood stood alone again, just an old tree marking where Buck's wife was buried 7 years ago. Silence settled over the pasture, broken only by approaching sirens and Emma's voice on the radio. "Buck? Buck, respond. The thermal signatures just disappeared." Buck dropped the rifle and fell to his knees beside Sarah's grave marker. The choice was made, the sacrifice complete. He'd given up his last chance to see her again, to touch her transformed face, to escape the loneliness that had consumed him since her death. But for the first time in 7 years, the weight in his chest felt like grief instead of desperation, clean sorrow instead of consuming obsession. Sarah was finally free to rest, and Buck could finally learn to live with her memory instead of dying for her ghost. Buck remained on his knees beside the grave marker, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. The rifle lay forgotten in the frost beside him, its barrel still warm despite the October cold, where moments before reality had bent and twisted around the cottonwood, now only ordinary darkness pressed against the edges of his vision. The absence felt profound, not just Sarah's vanished form, but the complete withdrawal of something that had been watching him, stalking him, feeding on his grief for 7 years. The silence was different now, empty in a way that suggested genuine conclusion rather than temporary retreat. "Buck!" Emma's voice carried across the pasture, followed by the beam of a powerful flashlight cutting through the darkness. Sheriff Martinez's heavy footsteps crunched through frost-brittle grass beside her lighter stride. "Jesus Christ, Buck, what happened out here?" Buck tried to stand, his knees protesting after kneeling on frozen ground. The simple act of rising felt monumental, as if he was lifting more than just his physical weight. Emma reached him first, her thermal imaging device beeping frantically as she scanned the area around the cottonwood. "The energy signatures are completely gone," she said, studying the readouts with professional fascination despite her obvious concern. Whatever was generating that heat source just vanished. "Buck, I recorded temperature fluctuations of over 40 degrees in a matter of seconds. That's physically impossible." Sheriff Martinez approached more cautiously, his service weapon drawn but lowered. The lawman's weathered face showed the strain of responding to Emma's increasingly frantic radio calls, arriving to find thermal anomalies that defied explanation, and a rancher kneeling beside his dead wife's grave with a discharged rifle. "Buck, son, I need you to talk to me," Martinez said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd handled domestic situations for 3 decades. Emma called about strange readings, possible intruders. She mentioned gunfire. "Are you injured?" Buck finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than expected. "I'm fine, Miguel. The situation is resolved." "What situation?" Martinez's eyes moved between Buck's haggard face and the rifle lying in the frost. "Buck, if someone was threatening you, if there was some kind of confrontation—" "There's no one to arrest," Buck said, managing a weak smile. "No crime committed, just a man finally learning to let his wife rest in peace." Emma studied her instruments with growing confusion. "The electromagnetic disturbances have completely ceased. It's like someone threw a switch and turned off whatever was generating those impossible readings." "Buck, what did you shoot at?" Buck looked down at the grave marker, Sarah's name carved in granite that would endure long after his own death. For the first time since her funeral, he could read those letters without feeling like they were burning into his retinas, the desperate need to join her, to follow her into whatever existence she'd found beyond death, had evaporated when the portal collapsed. "I shot at my own obsession," Buck said finally, "and I finally hit the target." Martinez holstered his weapon, recognizing something in Buck's posture that suggested genuine resolution rather than crisis. "The missing cattle situation, is that connected to tonight?" "The cattle are gone," Buck said. "They won't be coming back, but I don't think we'll lose any more animals to whatever was taking them." Emma continued scanning with her thermal equipment, documenting readings that would perplex her for years to come. The scientific part of her mind insisted on gathering data even when that data made no rational sense, but the human part recognized something fundamental had shifted in Buck's demeanor, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized was there until it disappeared. "Buck," she said quietly, "the thermal signature I detected beneath this tree, it was massive. Something that size doesn't just vanish without leaving traces. If you know what was out here—" "Some things don't leave traces that show up on instruments," Buck interrupted. Some things exist in the spaces between what we think we know about the world. He bent to retrieve his rifle, checking the chamber automatically despite knowing it was empty. The weapon felt heavier than usual, weighted with the memory of the most important shot he'd ever fired. Not at a target he wanted to hit, but at a connection he'd needed to sever. "I should file a report," Martinez said, though his tone suggested reluctance. "Discharge of a firearm, possible endangerment." "File whatever you need to file," Buck said, starting to walk back toward the house. "But there's no danger anymore. Not to me, not to anyone else's livestock, not to anyone who might be tempted to chase ghosts instead of facing grief." The three of them walked across the frozen pasture, their footsteps the only sound breaking October's profound silence. Behind them, the cottonwood stood sentinel over Sarah's grave, but it was just a tree now, no longer a doorway, no longer a feeding ground for creatures that promised eternity in exchange for willing surrender to obsession. Buck felt lighter with each step away from the grave, though he knew he'd return tomorrow to plant the wildflowers Sarah had loved in life. Not because she demanded tribute from beyond death, but because honoring memory was different from serving ghosts. The immediate conflict was resolved, but learning to live with clean grief instead of consuming obsession would take time. For the first time in 7 years, Buck had time to give. The walk back to the house felt longer than the walk out, though they covered the same frozen ground. Buck's legs trembled with exhaustion, 7 years of sleepless nights finally catching up to him now that the adrenaline was fading. Each step carried him further from the cottonwood, and deeper into a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar, not because anything had changed, but because he was experiencing it through different eyes. "Coffee," Buck said as they reached the porch. "I should make coffee." It was a mundane offering, almost absurdly normal after what had transpired in the pasture. But normalcy felt precious now, something to be treasured rather than endured. Emma and Martinez exchanged glances before following him inside. The kitchen lights seemed brighter than usual, or perhaps Buck was seeing clearly for the first time in years. The familiar space looked different, still his home, still filled with Sarah's touches, but no longer a shrine to be maintained in desperate hope of her return. The coffee maker gurgled to life, its ordinary sound more comforting than any supernatural whisper. "Buck," Emma said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table, "I need to ask directly. What happened out there?" Buck poured 3 cups, his hands steady despite the night's events. "I said goodbye to your stepmother. Finally, properly said goodbye. That doesn't explain the thermal readings, the electromagnetic disturbances. Some things don't need explaining." Buck sat across from his daughter, noting how much she looked like Sarah in the kitchen light. But instead of the familiar stab of grief, he felt something warmer. Gratitude that Sarah lived on in Emma's expressions, her gestures, her stubborn insistence on understanding the impossible. They just need accepting. Martinez sipped his coffee, watching Buck with the careful attention of someone trained to read human behavior. "The missing livestock situation. You mentioned it was resolved. You sound certain." "I am certain." Buck stared into his cup, seeing only dark liquid instead of endless questions. "Whatever was taking them is gone. It won't be back." "How can you know that?" Buck met the sheriff's eyes directly. "Because I stopped feeding it." The explanation hung in the air between them, insufficient for rational minds, but somehow complete. Martinez had worked law enforcement long enough to recognize when a case had reached its natural conclusion, even when that conclusion defied procedural understanding. Emma pulled out her phone, scrolling through the thermal data she'd recorded. The readings were off the charts, Buck. Energy signatures consistent with some kind of dimensional disturbance. "As a scientist, I can't just accept that it's over without understanding what it was. As my daughter," Buck said gently, "maybe you can trust that some battles are fought with weapons science doesn't measure." The words created a bridge between them that had been missing for years. Emma looked up from her data, seeing not the obsessed widower she'd worried about, but the father she'd lost to grief. Something fundamental had shifted in Buck's face, the haunted desperation replaced by simple, honest sorrow. "I thought I'd lost you too," Emma admitted. "After Sarah died, you became someone I didn't recognize. chasing shadows, ignoring everything real in favor of ghosts, Buck finished. I was chasing ghosts instead of living with memories. There's a difference. Martinez drained his coffee and stood. I'll file a report about the discharge of a firearm, but it'll note no injuries, no property damage, no ongoing threat. Sometimes the best police work is knowing when to step back and let people work things out themselves. After the sheriff left, Buck and Emma sat in comfortable silence. The kitchen clock ticked past midnight, marking the end of October 15th, Sarah's death anniversary. For 7 years, this date had brought escalating terror and loss. Tonight, it brought conclusion. I kept some of her paintings, Emma said finally. The watercolors she did of the ranch. I thought maybe, if you want them back. Buck smiled, the expression feeling rusty but genuine. I'd like that. But not because I need them. Because they're beautiful, and she'd want them appreciated rather than worshipped. Emma reached across the table, covering Buck's weathered hand with her own. Are you going to be okay? Really okay, not just going through the motions? Buck considered the question seriously. The house around them no longer felt like a mausoleum. Sarah's absence was still painful, would always be painful, but it no longer felt like an open wound demanding constant attention. He could remember her laugh without needing to hear it again. He could honor her memory without sacrificing his future. I think I'm going to learn how to be okay, Buck said. It might take time, but I finally have time to give. Outside, October wind rattled the windows, but it sounded like weather instead of whispers. The cottonwood stood alone in the pasture, guarding nothing more than peaceful rest. For the first time in 7 years, Buck looked forward to dawn, the new beginning. Dawn came quietly, slipping across the Bitterroot Mountains with the soft grey light of late October. Buck woke naturally for the first time in years, not jolted awake by nightmares or the phantom sound of Sarah's voice calling from the pasture. He lay still for a moment, listening to the ordinary silence of his house. The furnace cycling on, wind moving through the eaves, the distant lowing of cattle that were actually there. Emma was already in the kitchen when he came downstairs, scrambling eggs and brewing fresh coffee. She'd stayed the night, sleeping in her old room that Buck had preserved exactly as she'd left it when she went away to college. But unlike Sarah's untouched spaces, Emma's room felt lived in again, rather than fossilized. "Sleep well?" she asked, though her smile suggested she already knew the answer. "Better than I have in 7 years." Buck accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how the morning light streaming through the kitchen windows looked different, brighter somehow, less filtered through the lens of endless grief. "You didn't have to cook." "I wanted to. It feels—" Emma paused, searching for the right words. "It feels like home again. Like we're a family, instead of 2 people tiptoeing around a ghost." They ate breakfast together, talking about practical things, the cattle that needed moving to winter pasture, repairs the barn roof required before snow fell in earnest, Emma's research project on wildlife migration patterns. Normal conversations between a father and daughter, weighted with years of lost time but not burdened by supernatural dread. After Emma left to drive back to Missoula, Buck found himself walking toward the cottonwood almost without conscious decision, but this time, approaching Sarah's grave felt like visiting rather than pilgrimage. The tree stood exactly as it had for decades, roots deep in Montana soil, branches reaching toward clear sky. Buck knelt beside the granite marker, running his fingers over Sarah's carved name. "I'm sorry it took me so long to let you rest," he said quietly. "I thought holding on was love, but it was just fear dressed up as devotion." The wind stirred the cottonwood's bare branches, creating the soft whisper of leaves that had already fallen. Buck listened without searching for hidden messages, hearing only autumn's natural music. He pulled wildflower seeds from his jacket pocket, Indian paintbrush and mountain lupine, varieties Sarah had cultivated in her garden when she was alive, not as shrine offerings, but because she genuinely loved their wild beauty. Buck scattered the seeds around the grave marker, knowing they'd bloom next spring whether he was there to see them or not. Standing, Buck looked across his ranch with eyes unclouded by obsession for the first time since Sarah's death. The pastures stretched toward the mountains, dotted with cattle that belonged in this world, under this sky, his land, his legacy, his responsibility. Not a prison of memory, but a working ranch that demanded attention to the present moment. The missing cattle would never return, and Buck had made peace with that loss. Whatever realm the Dogman had dragged them to was beyond his reach or concern now. The important thing was that no more animals would vanish into supernatural slavery. No more neighbors would lose livestock to feed a creature that promised eternity while delivering imprisonment. Buck spent the afternoon repairing fence line that had been neglected during his years of obsessive grief. Physical labor felt good, sweat and strain that served practical purpose rather than futile gesture. His muscles protested the unaccustomed work, but his mind felt clearer with each post he set, each wire he stretched tight. Sheriff Martinez stopped by around sunset, ostensibly to check on fence repairs, but actually ensuring Buck's mental state remained stable. They worked together in comfortable silence, two men who understood that some conversations happened without words. "Heard from Emma today," Martinez mentioned as they loaded tools into Buck's truck. "She said you're thinking about hiring help for the spring roundup." "Thinking about it," Buck confirmed. "Ranch this size needs more than one man, especially one pushing 60 with creaky knees." "Smart thinking. Sarah always said you were too stubborn to ask for help." Buck smiled at the memory. Sarah had said that, frequently and with exasperated affection. But hearing her quoted no longer felt like a knife twist in his chest, more like an old friend sharing a fond recollection. That night, Buck sat in his living room reading a novel, instead of staring at trail cam footage. The book was one of Sarah's favorites, a mystery set in the Scottish Highlands that he'd never bothered with when she was alive. Reading her marginalia felt like discovering a conversation they'd never had, intimate but not heartbreaking, connected but not desperate. Before bed, Buck looked out at the pasture one final time. The cottonwood stood silhouetted against star-filled sky, marking where Sarah rested but no longer serving as doorway between worlds. Tomorrow would bring ordinary challenges: weather, cattle, the endless work of keeping a ranch running. Buck found himself genuinely curious about tomorrow, eager to meet it with clear eyes and steady hands.